Darren, would you mind taking over with your part of the presentation? I will stop my share.
Yeah, sure. Okay, that was a great presentation, by the way. Well done, guys. Really interesting, the accessibility stuff. That's something I'm definitely going to be looking into. Never really thought about it like that. That was really cool. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about conditions and variables in interaction libraries. So obviously, kind of similar kind of journey to the guys at Gojek. And before I kind of get into showing you some examples, I just want to kind of give you a bit of backstory to my kind of journey in thinking about interaction libraries in ProtoPie and how it connects to like a larger design system, and also kind of part of how I evangelized doing that within large organizations. Okay, so I've worked on a lot of projects, worked on a lot of design systems, and I've spent a lot of time building prototypes. And kind of what I ended up with was all these components all over the place in all these different Pi files. And I never really seemed to have enough time to kind of like bring them all together, but decided to set a task for me to actually go through all of my designs I designed for all these other companies and kind of bring out the common components and kind of bring them together in a library. And I actually decided it'd be really cool to kind of create a library which I could actually make accessible publicly, because a lot of these libraries and design systems kind of like sit internally inside of companies and kind of stay there. And there's obviously, I can see that there's a need for interactive prototyping within companies, but not necessarily that those design teams have the skills to kind of get there very quickly. So I was just about to do that until Microsoft came calling, and got a call from Microsoft asking me if I'd kindly come along and build a ProtoPie library for the then unreleased Windows 11. So I obviously said yes, went to work for Microsoft, worked on a library for about a year. And some of the things we were looking to do, or they were looking to do, was firstly to enable designers to prototype advanced prototypes without advanced knowledge. It's kind of a bit of a barrier to entry when you're coming into ProtoPie for the first time, and then, you know, having the need to kind of get into components and libraries and all those sorts of things. So we want to give the ability for people to be able to just kind of drag and drop these things. One of the things that Windows needs to do is work on any size device. There's a plethora of devices that the operating system needs to work on. So therefore, we need to be able to test how it would look on different devices. So all of the components need to be resizable, completely decoupled from each other, and also need to be smart. So certainly, as you maybe saw in the video on the right there, with the kind of core components, is certainly what we call like the Windows shell. You could drag a desktop component, a taskbar, and a start. You could even just like throw the start on the screen in any position, and it's going to work out exactly where it needs to be automatically for you. And you don't need to do any setup. You don't need to put in any overrides in or anything like that. They're just smart. They kind of know how to work together. And in fact, there's some intrinsic connections between those components to make them work together. Obviously, again, like Gojek, it needs to be themable. So we built a theme system into the component library, not just dark and light theme, but customized themes as well. So we had to look into doing that. So yeah, after about a year, we created this system. I learned a hell of a lot. I worked with some really smart people. I was one of many prototypers, and there was a lot of prototyping with coding background. So I learned a hell of a lot, which really kind of fueled me even more to kind of create this this publicly available library. So I kind of finished at Microsoft, and then came back to my own library and decided to kind of brand it. So it's called SkeletonUI, and it's basically made up of mainly mobile components. So I set about kind of created documentation, again, like others have done, which is kind of publicly available, thinking about how you would document a component library for others to use. I think to the question, how do you onboard kind of new designers to use a library? So there's a mix of document, like quite traditional documentation, but also you do have some ability within ProtoPie to document internally as well. Okay. And really, I created SkeletonUI for this reason, like to help designers prototype more quickly, to enable designers to create advanced prototypes without advanced knowledge. So same as what I did at Microsoft. But more importantly, or equally important, to use it as a learning tool. So for designers to be able to go into components, see how I've created them, and learn how to create them themselves. And I think there's a lot to be said about ProtoPie being a very democratizing experience for designers. There's no kind of lockdown, like you can't protect your components to stop people going into them necessarily, unless you're kind of using libraries, but there's certainly ways to do it. So you can make sure that everyone's got access and they can go in and kind of have a look around and kind of learn from it. So that was a really important reason to do it. And to that extent, all of the triggers and responses are really clean, everything's named, and there's really a lot of thought that goes into, you know, how can somebody instantly know how this component works just by going in and looking at it. Okay, enough of the backstory. I'm going to delve into some examples inside of SkeletonUI to kind of show you kind of my thinking, how I kind of achieve certain things, and hopefully you can get some tips on how to create your own components. Okay, so the first use case I'm going to share with you is how you control component state. This is obviously quite an important one and quite a common one. Okay, so over here I've got yes, the infamous button component. Everyone starts with the button component. It's the most simple UI component that we use. And it's obviously a component that has many states, as in the other talk. So similar to the guys, I'm creating overrides here. So you can see I'm actually creating overrides not only for the disabled state here, but also for some color states. So again, building some themable aspects to it. So you can bring out this button, and if it's on a dark background, you can change the different states, and they're kind of all using overrides as well. And then, as you can see on the right-hand side, if I set this disabled value to 1, so basically I'm using a lots of zeros and ones in states. And if you've got any coding background, you'll be familiar with 0 and 1 equals to true and false, which is what we call a Boolean value. And I'm just using that kind of concept here. So you could use a text value, you could say true or false, but obviously it's easier to type a 0 or 1, less prone to human error. So disabled is 1, so if you put 1 in there, it's going to make that button disabled, and you can see it here on the right-hand side. Okay, so inside the component, this is what's happening. So I'm starting with a number variable. So components have their own variables, they're internal to the component, in difference to the other types of variables you have in ProtoPie, which are for a single scenes and for all scenes. Components have their own variables. So I'm starting with a variable, I'm making it overridable. So you just check this box, and that suddenly makes it accessible to people using your component on the outside. And then I'm using a detect trigger. So I'm detecting when the prototype loads, that's when the variable is going to be changed. So I'm overriding it. So I'm using that to detect the state, and that fires off this condition block. And there's a condition for if it's disabled, do some stuff. If it's enabled, do some other stuff. And over here you can see the condition inside the context panel. So for condition 1, so this is disabled, it's basically looking to see if disabled equals 1, and it's looking at the variable here. And if it is, then it's going to do that stuff. And then conversely, if it's enabled, it obviously needs to see if it equates to 0. So it's really as simple as that to create a component with component states. Obviously, you could add more states and you could have more conditions if you wanted to. Okay, So second example, so creating unique component instances. So this is something that's asked a lot in the community. It's something you don't get out of the box with ProtoPie. And as soon as you start getting into components and instances, you're going to want to be able to talk to them directly and individually. So here's how you do it. So you can see over here, I've got a radio component. So that's a single component, but it's not only individual, as in it's unique, it also needs to act as part of a group, because obviously a radio becomes a radio set and you choose one option among many. Okay, so over here on the right, we've got the overrides panel again. So there's two variables I'm using. So there's the name variable, which is giving each radio button itself a unique name. And then there's this radio group variable. And this is the value I'm using to make this component smart, so that it's aware of any other instances that are within its set, so it knows to kind of switch between. Okay, so that's all you need to do on the outside to make it work. A lot going on the inside, again, but like all good components, we always start with variables. So there's a number of variables here, a number of things going on. So you can see like the name variable here and the radio group variable, they're the two override variables. They're the two initial values I'm getting. As soon as I get a message, I'm receiving that from the scene. I'm assigning that value to the variable. So basically what's happening is that when you click the radio, I'm going to send a message to the scene saying that the radio is clicked, and I'm sending with it the name variable. And I'm also actually sending the radio group variable as well. So I'm saying, you know, the Apple radio has been clicked. And then as soon as that hits the scene, I've got another message inside of my component that's receiving it back in. So it's listening for that and it's receiving it back in. So basically bouncing the overridden variables out of the component and then bringing them straight back in. Okay. When they come back in, they're being assigned to these other variables, so receive group and selected name. Okay, so now I've got the initial names and I've got the bounce names. Because what you got to remember is that a bunch of component instances are not aware of each other. So they're all getting these messages all at the same time, right? Okay, so that message comes in, and then I'm using a condition where I'm comparing the two variables. So I'm basically saying, so is the name that this radio button is, does that match what the selected name? So are these two values the same? And if they're the same, then that means that particular instance has been selected. Okay, so then I now therefore know that it's been selected. It's a little bit more complicated in this one because I'm doing it for two values. I'm not only looking at when the name is selected by comparing those two variables, I'm also looking to see if it's part of the radio group as well. So it knows how to switch. So lots of variables, lots of conditions, and lots of kind of like comparisons going on to make this all work. And it might seem quite complex, but once you've done it for the first time, it suddenly becomes second nature. And this was a bit of an epiphany for me when I learned how to do this. I learned it from a coder, and so really important to like make friends with your developers and kind of learn a bit about how things work there, because there's definitely some transferable skills inside of that. Okay, number 3, formulas in variables. Just want to talk a little bit about how I'm using those. So I've got this slider control, so you can see I'm sliding it up and down. It's also broadcasting the percentage value. Now these sliders can be any width. You can make them as long or short as you like. It's always going to return a percentage value. Okay, so how I'm doing that, again, I'm using some variables. So I've got a progress change variable. These two variables are basically on the outside of the component. So we're currently outside the component, so I'm using the component. I'm going to set a variable in the scene. And I need to set a variable in the scene because whenever I receive a value from a component, a variable value from a component, I can't access it directly in a message. I have to write it to a variable first, and then I can access it, which is why we've kind of got this dependency where we have to have these variables defined in our scene as well. Okay, so I've got my variable set up. There's just 2 here because I've got 2 sliders in this prototype. And this is kind of what the receive response looks like. So when I receive, and I'm using receive from component here, so as opposed to bouncing it off the scene, I'm actually talking directly to a particular instance. And I've got a message that is going to broadcast called progress change. And as soon as I get that message, I'm going to write it to this variable. Okay. And then once that variable gets that value, I've got a text response, which is using a formula, really super simple formula. It's just grabbing that variable value progress change, and it's writing it into that text field there. So basically, every time the user moves the slider, it's going to fire that message, it's going to update that variable, and every time that changes, the number's going to change. So that's what's happening on the outside. On the inside, not too complicated. So again, we've got that progress percentage variable on the inside. And then what I'm doing, I'm detecting when the thumb, so make that circle, is being moved. So I'm detecting when thumb.x is being moved, doing a bunch of stuff, but specifically around the variable stuff, I'm assigning a value to that variable, that progress percentage variable. Okay, and inside of that assignment is a formula. So there's a fairly, not too long, but kind of lengthy, obviously doesn't fit in the formula window, but a formula which is basically working out based on the width of the track, based on the position of the slider, a little bit of simple maths, it's working out the percentage, and it's writing that value into the variable dynamically. So every time it's changing, it's constantly rewriting it, and that's firing off the message. So you can see here, we've got the send progress change message, which is the message that's going out, which is what you're receiving, as I showed you on the previous slide. Okay, finally, creating a timer. Again, something else that a lot of people in the community are trying to figure out how to use, how to do. It's quite simple. There's, as in ProtoPie, lots of different ways of doing it probably, but this is the way I'm doing it. So basically, I've got this, if it appears, snack bar component. There you go. It took a while to come on screen. It's staying on screen for a particular period of time, and then it's going away. So that delay, that time it stays on screen, I wanted to give the people using the component the ability to control. So you can see over here, we've got a simple override, which is just duration. So that's the time it's appearing on screen. So you can change that to how many seconds you want it to stay on screen. Okay, inside, I've kind of cherry picked some parts of it. There's obviously there's a lot going on in this component, but effectively I'm receiving a message to start the timer. And the timer is actually a variable. So again, it's just a component variable that I've created, just a number variable. And when that timer gets started, I'm going to start by using this formula. So I'm declaring the timer. So I'm saying, hey, whatever the value of the timer currently has, I want to add 1 to it. So obviously it's going to start at 0, and I'm going to add 1. And then again, when it will be now 1 plus 1 is 2, and 2 plus 1 is 3. So it's going to basically count up. Okay. So how do I get it to count up? Well, I'm just using the repeat function that you have inside of ProtoPie. So you just check this repeat box, and that will uncover a few options. You've got the count and the interval. You can see the duration. So that's basically that overridden variable. I'm using the variable value directly inside the count field. And I'm to have an interval of 1 second. So basically it's counting up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or whatever the duration is. Once the duration is met, so I'm obviously using the detect trigger to detect when the timer is complete. When that condition fires, it's going to move the snack bar back down, and it's going to reset the timer variable back to 0 as well. Okay, so really simple mechanism for creating timers, and you can use this in. It doesn't have to be inside of a component, by the way. You can use this outside of components as well, of course. Okay, that's all I have to show you today. If you want to learn more about components, you can definitely check out my SkeletonUI library. So it's available on my website. And actually, for you guys today, if you do want to get it, you can use this code to get 50% off. But really, I want to kind of just evangelize that out. There's a few videos on my YouTube channel as well, talking about components and how to do some of this stuff as well. And there'll be some more coming. And there's some public documentation as well. So you can kind of have a look at the documentation to see, just out of interest, how I'm documenting components. I think that's going to be quite interesting. So thanks for your time. And I'll stop talking now.
Thank you for the great presentation, Darren. I found it very useful, and I think I'm sure actually that our attendance today. Also found it very useful. Okay, let's see what questions we have in the Q&A. I will go to the Q&A and okay, so this one is both for Gojek, for Louis and Riyadi and Darren. So Darren, maybe you want to share how, if you have any kind of log, like error tracing system set up in your components?
Yeah, so yeah, something I need to kind of do a video on. Yeah, so there's I custom roll my own components for tracing and basically for debugging. So you've got a very basic debugging feature inside of ProtoPie where you can look at a variable directly, but the problem with that is you can't look at variables that are inside of components when you're outside of a component. So basically I'm using messages again, which all those messages coming out, you can pass to anything, right? So you can basically have another component that receives that message. So I'll have a little draggable panel that I can just drag in. It's another component that I'll configure. Sometimes you have to manually configure these things if you want to trace specific variable components, but that's definitely the only way you can currently do that in ProtoPie if you want to receive messages. So if you want to receive values outside the component when they're kind of being broadcast inside the component. So yeah, I custom roll that, and in fact I custom roll a lot of I guess behind the scenes things to control things. So in the Windows 11 library, there's a whole bunch of settings that I did in the same way to create for the taskbar to be sized up, the icons to be sized up with different sizes and to arrange things left and right. That's another thing you can do with components and broadcasting of these variables.
Thank you so much, Darren. Okay, let's cover one more question, also from Tobias. So regarding the use case about the timer, what is the most common pitfalls for failure when creating a timer?
Pitfalls for failure. In terms, I'm not sure I understand the question there. As in the timer not working? I mean, I'm not sure. I guess you just need to make sure that it depends on what you're using the timer for, I guess. There is I mean, making sure that you reset the timer if you're reusing it over and over again. There is some nuances in ProtoPie depending on how fast the timer's running. There is a frame rate to ProtoPie, so it can only receive messages, it can only receive things at a certain speed. There is some really kind of edge cases where something might not fire in time for you receiving it, and then that might not trigger. But you're getting down to a tenth of a second kind of situations there. So a lot of these timers, and obviously we're effectively prototyping things, shouldn't really be too much of an issue. But no, I haven't really had any failure situations with timers specifically that I can remember.
Okay, thank you, Darren. Tobias, I hope this answers your question. Okay, Darren, one other question for you. If you need to pass multiple parameters to component, for example, in radio button, you need to send name and group name. Do you prefer multiple messages or one message with parameters combined with random separators, for example, and then a slash, and then parse the parameters on the receiver side? So the question is from the Q&A.
Right, yeah, wow, that sounds very complicated, the last one. So at the moment, I'm sending where I need to send multiple parameters, I'm sending multiple messages. And I think that's a choice to make things simple and easy to understand. The ultimate goal of Skeleton is for designers who don't know anything about code to start to tip their toes into things which are kind of code-esque. There is certain, obviously, fundamental programming concepts that are being used within these things. So parsing sounds like a scary word. Using long strings sounds like a scary thing. So yeah, I'd probably err on the side of making it easier to use and easier to understand, even if it's a little bit more work. Because ultimately, I want people to be able to learn and make their own stuff, not just use my stuff. So it's about kind of getting them confident enough to be able to do that. Maybe when they're at that level, you could then go into like super advanced and kind of look at more things that are leaning more to the code side. And I think once we get a formula window which is actually expandable, so we can see more than one line, then that might be a lot easier. That's a bit of a problem as well at the moment for doing anything too lengthy inside of the formulas.
Thank you, Darren. Really, I hope this is useful. Darren, we have some questions regarding the SkeletonUI library that you built. So one question is how much time it took you? And a related question is whether the trace component is available in this library.
So the first question is a bit like Pablo Picasso story where he draws this picture for a woman on a bench, and she said, "How long did it take you to learn?" He said, "That's all my life." Right. So I've been building components I've been using ProtoPie since 2017, and I've been building components since they started. So I think there's a lot. It's really hard to kind of say how long it took because there's obviously the experience to do it, learning on lots of different projects. So it certainly took. I think it probably took like the actual mechanics of sitting down and doing it was probably like 2 or 3 months of work. But bearing in mind, I'd already built a lot of stuff, and it was more about figuring out what's the best way to re-engineer them to make them easy to use, and how I can make them flexible and talk to each other and all those kind of things. So yeah, there was a lot of work. I mean, there was the year at Microsoft, obviously learning a lot of things as well. So yeah, you could say probably a couple of years really from end to end of kind of figuring it all out. But obviously that wasn't kind of the time it took to physically put the components together. What was the second half of the question?
Second part was whether the trace component is available in SkeletonUI.
The what component?
The trace component.
The tray. Oh, what? Like the sliding up card? Is that what you mean?
If so you can provide us with more, yeah.
There's a card sliding up component. It's quite basic, though. It doesn't turn into a full screen card that's turned into a scrollable view like you have on Google Maps. I have got that planned in though, because that's quite tricky to do, especially when you're moving from a drag to a scroll in ProtoPie. So yeah, I've got some hacks I think to kind of get around that limitation. But yeah, that's definitely, and anybody once people anybody using it, if there's any requests for components, I can add it to the library as well. And kind of once you get it, you kind of get it for life. So you'll get anything updated, I think. So yeah, but that's a basic card at the moment though. Nothing too special. Nothing you can do on your own, I don't think.
All right. So they're saying trace as in log error component. But I hope.
Trace. Sorry. No, not tray. Trace. No,
Trace.
There isn't. But I do have plans. Again, it comes back to what people need. It's like you put in what you think people need, and then people tell you what they need. So I'm definitely happy to add trace component. I have a trace component which I can easily add into it. So yes, I could do that if you want it.
Awesome. One other question that would be useful for everyone, I think. Do you have a structure or logic for naming variables in library or project? Is it something you can share? Best practices, maybe?
Yeah, well, that was in the talk yesterday. So if you wasn't in the talk yesterday, I talked very much about that. So I use camel case in the way I name things. I've been playing around a lot with naming things in different ways. But I've kind of settled on camel case, so that's obviously a capital letter for each word, no spaces. You want to avoid spaces. You can't put spaces in variables anyway. So camel case is my flavor of choice. You can use underscores. You can use hyphens, I think, in variable names. When I'm doing them as overrides, I use camel case because that's the name you're going to see in the override as well. So unfortunately, we can't put spaces in variables. So to make them as human readable as possible, I do use camel case, or maybe sometimes underscores is a little bit easier to read. But yeah, one of those two really. Obviously, adding underscores adds more characters, so it makes things longer. Whereas camel case is the shortest way of doing it, and it's a very common practice in programming.
Awesome, thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question because our session does need to be wrapped up in the next 5 minutes. Let's see. In the chat box, Sam is asking, can you plug and play components from your SkeletonUI library into any ProtoPie file? Are they customizable? I can't get my head around variables.
Yes. When you get the library, you get basically, it's not a library as a ProtoPie library that's separate. It's a Pi file with local components in it. So you have complete access to them. You can drag and drop components between Pi files. Obviously, you don't get the connectivity that you do in a library, i.e. essential place to update, but there are some pros and cons to that anyway in ProtoPie. So often I will just drag and drop a component in to do some stuff locally. I don't need to necessarily have it connected to something else when I'm prototyping. And yeah, they're fully customizable because you've got access to everything inside. You can see how it's all built.
Amazing. Sam, thanks you for clarifying that. Okay, I think we might have to slowly wrap up today's session. Thank you so much, Darren, for graciously handling the Q&A